and welcome back to the Maker Jane channel, where I share all things English paper piecing, from tips and tutorials to projects and more. So if you love EPP like I do, please consider subscribing. My name is Janie, and in this video, I am beginning a brand new series here on my channel called Flowers and Butterflies. It's going to be an English paper piecing skill building series, and every few weeks, I will release a new flower and a new butterfly pattern that will help you to build your English paper piecing skills. So whether you're a beginner at English paper piecing and you've never ever tried it before, or whether you are an avid English paper piecer and you want to develop and learn some new skills relating to your English paper piecing practice, then the series is for you. We'll be covering everything from the very basics of getting started with English paper piecing. We will be working with different shapes, and I'll give you some of my key tips for basting and stitching different shapes together. We're also going to be covering fussy cutting. So if you've never done any fussy cutting or you would like to develop your fussy cutting skills, we'll be talking extensively on that. And we will also be covering curves and working with curves, how to baste them and how to stitch them. At the end of this series, I'll be sharing with you a special free English paper piecing project that you can use all of the flowers and butterflies that you make during this series. There will be a total of 6 patterns in this skill building series, each pattern consisting of a unique flower and butterfly, including templates, instructions, assembly diagrams, and coloring pages for you to enjoy. And I will include a link in each video down in the description to the pattern for that video. Be sure to collect all 6 of the patterns to use in your future English paper piecing projects. In addition to the pattern and the video tutorial, I've also created a private Facebook group where you can come and share the makes that you're making from the flowers and butterflies patterns, and also share with us some of the skills that you're learning during this skill building series. I put a link down below in the description so you can join us in this series. I'm excited to get into the first pattern with you today, so let's go ahead and talk about it. This first pattern of the Flowers and Butterflies skill building series is the basics. So if you're new to English paper piecing, this is going to be a perfect pattern for you to get familiar with the basic process of English paper piecing. We're going to be working with hexagons in this pattern and this video. So let's head over to the work table and we will get to start working on our first Flowers and Butterflies pattern. The first thing you're going to need is the free pattern that I have linked down below in the description for you. This particular pattern uses hexagons, and I've included 3 different sizes for you to enjoy for this pattern. You can make whatever size flower or butterfly you want. You'll need 7 hexagons for the flower, and we'll be making 2 flowers for the free project at the end of this series. You'll need some coordinating thread that matches the fabrics you've chosen for your flower. I like to use a needle threader. It's very helpful when working with the needles that I recommend for English paper piecing. And this particular one has a nice light on the end of it, so it makes it very easy to see the eye of the needle and get that threaded quickly and painlessly. I'll put a link down below in the description where you can find a needle threader like this one. The next item in my English paper piecing kit that I like to use are these paper sorting fingertips. They work great as a thimble. They're soft and comfortable, and I actually prefer those over thimbles. These are the needles that I prefer to use. This particular brand happens to be John James, but any milliner's size 10 or 11 needle will work beautifully for English paper piecing. It's a very fine needle with a very small eye, and these work especially well when working with batik fabrics. This is a needle minder, and I love using needle minders with my English paper piecing because not only does it hold my needle when I need to set it down, but it also helps me to hold my shapes together while stitching, which really relieves my fingers from pain and having to use a lot of pressure to hold the pieces together. You can find needle minders in my shop, which I will link to down below in the description. For basting your shapes, you'll need a glue pen. And I won't be covering basting in this video, but I do have a video that shows you how to do that, which I'll link up above. And lastly, you're going to need some scissors. So go ahead and download the free pattern, cut out your templates, and get your templates basted to your fabric, and then you'll be ready to get started with the rest of this video as we assemble our first English paper piecing flower. After you've gotten your templates basted to the fabric, the next step is to lay out your pieces in the order that you want them to be once they're stitched together. This is a very important step because sometimes our fabric has different color arrangement, and we might want our flower to look a very specific way. So laying them in order will help you to sew them in order. Once you have them in order, the next step is to start sewing. And I like to start with the hexagon that's on the top and sew that to the one that's in the middle along that top seam. So I'm just attaching my needle minder here to help me hold my pieces together, and then we'll begin stitching. It's very important that you make sure that your edges and your corners are all lined up, because that will ensure your pieces fitting together properly as you stitch. Whenever I begin with new thread, I like to bury my thread underneath the seam allowance. And that just helps keep the thread tail out of the way so that I'm not fighting with it as I'm stitching. At the beginning of every pass or every edge that you stitch, it's important to knot your thread. So here I'm just taking 2 quick stitches in the same exact spot, and then this third stitch, before pulling the thread all the way through, I leave a little bit of a loop and I send the needle through that loop to secure a knot. Now we're going to do a simple whip stitch all the way down this seam line. I'm picking up just a couple of threads from each side of the fabric, as you can see here, and pulling the thread through. By picking up just a couple of threads from each fabric, I am ensuring that my thread will not be seen on the front side. If you pick up too much fabric on your needle, you risk being able to see your stitches on the front side of your work. And if that's what you're going for, that's totally fine. But I prefer to hide my stitches as much as possible, so I only pick up 2, maybe 3 threads of fabric from each piece. Now that I'm at the end of that seam, I am going to take 2 stitches in the same place, just like I did at the beginning, and a third stitch where I will knot before I pull that thread all the way through. Now it's time for the next hexagon piece. So I always like to set everything back down to where everything was arranged on the table to figure out where my next piece is going to go. So in this case, I'm going to be stitching counterclockwise around the flower. And I like to sew my hexagon flowers in a way that allows me to use a continuous piece of thread. So I'll be starting at that seam right there. And to do so, I flip the hexagon over so that I can stitch along that seam. Being sure to line up the pieces so that everything is straight and in line, securing it with the needle minder. And now I need to actually move my thread. You can see that it's in the center of those two pieces, and I need it to be over here on this end. So what I like to do is bury the thread so that I can sew this entire pass in one long pass, so I don't have to go back and forth. So I bury the thread into the seam allowance, making sure not to poke through the template paper through to the front of the template. So just kind of skimming under the surface of the seam allowance. Now that I'm at this end, I can sew this seam and the next seam in one continuous pass. And again, at the beginning of the seam, I'm going to take 2 stitches in the same spot and then make a 3rd stitch and knot that stitch to secure the end of the seam. If you ever find that your thread likes to knot on you and get tangled, which can be quite frustrating, there is a tool that I didn't bring out for this project, but it's called a thread conditioner. There's several on the market and you can try different ones. I have used beeswax in the past and it works fairly well. I used to use it a lot and I just haven't been using it lately. But that is something that can help prevent your thread from tangling as you're English paper piecing. So again, as we stitch along this seam, I am only picking up a couple of threads from each of the fabrics to keep my thread on the back side of my work. As you stitch your template pieces together into really any shape that you create in English paper piecing, you're going to start encountering these corners where you have multiple corner pieces of your templates meeting up in the same place. And it is extremely important to secure these corners in a way that will hold them together, but also you want to make sure that they are lined up properly so that you don't end up with holes in your work when you have these intersections. So lining up your pieces with the needle minder really helps to get everything in place and hold everything in place as you're stitching. So you want to knot at the end of your seam, and now we open our work and move to the next seam. Before attaching the needle minder, making sure that our edges are lined up and our corners meet with one another as well. Once you've got everything lined up, then you can begin stitching your seam. And remember, we always knot at the beginning of our seam and at the end. So again, just pulling 2 stitches through right on top of each other, and then the 3rd stitch before I pull it through, I loop, send the needle through the loop. And continue stitching down the seam. And then at the end, do the same thing. Take 2 stitches in the same spot, and then the 3rd stitch, send the needle through the loop to secure a knot. Now that that seam's completed, we can move on to the next template. So set your work back down on the table in the arrangement that you had it from the beginning, and pick up the next template that you'll be stitching. And we're going to follow the same order again. We're going to start on the seam that joins the 2 petals together and work our way into the center. Once the petal seam is sewn, open it up and reposition that petal against the center hexagon, realigning all your edges, making sure everything is straight and in alignment, especially at the corners, and begin your stitching of that next seam. Knotting at the beginning and at the end of your seam every time. Continue in the same way with each petal all the way around the flower until you get to the last petal, and I'll show you what to do with that last petal next. When you reach the last petal of your flower, you're going to have 3 seams to stitch. We'll sew them in this order, starting with the seam between the 2 petals, then we'll work to the center seam, and then that last seam between the other 2 petals. Begin this first seam just like you sewed all of the other petals onto your flower. Once you have secured your thread at the end of the seam, next it's time to reposition the petal so you can sew the next seam. So go ahead and line up your edges and your corners using your needle minder if you need to hold everything in place. Once that seam is done, you can reposition your petal for that final seam. Once all your seams are sewn, you can bury your thread tail underneath the seam allowance. And the hexagon flower is complete. Have fun making more of these hexy flowers in any of the 3 sizes included in the pattern. Next, let's make the hexagon butterfly. You'll need 7 template pieces for the butterfly. This particular butterfly I'm making is using the 1/2 inch hexy templates. You'll need your glue pen to baste your templates to your fabric. And again, there is a link to a video that I made for you showing you how to baste hexagons. You're going to need the same needles that we've used before, a needle minder, a thimble of some sort, coordinating thread. Here I've chosen purple to go with the fabrics that I'm using for the butterfly, your needle threader, and your scissors. Once you've basted your fabric to your template pieces, the next step is to lay out your pieces on the table so that you know which order to stitch them in. The pattern that I've linked for you down below also includes the assembly diagrams for your reference. So arrange your pieces where you want them. Here I've decided to put the fabric with the dots in the upper outer tip of the butterfly, and I'm just making some fine adjustments to the placement. Once you have your pieces where you want them, you can begin stitching. We'll be stitching this butterfly together in 2 different sections, which you can see here. I like to start with the section on the right, but you can start with either one. And I begin with the upper wing pieces of that section. Put your pieces right sides together, secure it with the needle minder, and begin stitching along the seam that joins those 2 pieces together. Just like we did with the hexagon flower, we're going to start off by burying the thread behind the seam allowance, knotting at the beginning of the seam with 2 stitches and the 3rd stitch looped through to make the knot. Then we will use the same exact stitching technique to sew this seam together. So we're using a very small whip stitch, picking up just a couple threads from each of the fabrics as we go along the seam. Your stitches don't need to be real close together. I would say about 1/8 of an inch apart between each of your stitches. And when you get to the end of that seam, you will secure it once again with 2 stitches right on top of each other and a final knotting stitch. Next, it's time to pick up the next piece. So we need to take the needle minder off, open our pieces up, and place them back on the table to get a feel for where you're at and where you want to go to next. I'm going to go ahead and attach that upper wing portion to the center body piece, which is the bright yellow. So putting the pieces right sides together and lining up the corners and the edges, I know that I need to move my thread over to the area where I want to stitch. So after I get my needle minder positioned, I'm going to bury my thread underneath the seam allowance, just like we did before, to get that thread over to the seam that I want to stitch. You might be wondering why I don't send the thread directly across the back of the template piece, and instead I go around underneath the seam allowance. That's because if I ever want to remove my template pieces from my work, the thread would be in my way if I had just sent it directly across the back of the template. So going around underneath the seam allowance allows me to be able to get the template piece out from behind my work if I need to for the project I am using this for. Secure your seam with your knotting stitches. Stitch along the seam with your whip stitch, picking up just a couple threads of each fabric. Knot your thread at the end of the seam, and then you'll be ready for the next piece. One more piece to go for this section of the butterfly, so you'll lay everything down back on the table. Get your placement set up for that last piece. Flip the piece over along the seam line that you're going to be stitching so that your pieces are right sides together. Get everything secured and lined up using your needle minder if you have to. Burying your thread so that you can get it into the position you need for that seam. And stitching along that seam, remembering to secure the beginning and the end with your knotting stitches. And for the last seam of this section, you'll open everything up and reposition your edges and corners, securing with your needle minder so you can stitch that final seam. Once that's done, go ahead and bury your thread in the seam allowance, trim it, And then you can move on to the next section of the butterfly. Stitch these 3 remaining wing pieces together using the same technique. Once you've done that, the last step is to join the 2 sections of the butterfly together along these 2 seams. And there you have it, your first English paper pieced butterfly. Here is what the butterfly looks like in each of the 3 template sizes that I've included in this pattern. This butterfly is made using the 1-inch hexagons. This one is made using the 3/4-inch hexagons. And this one here is made using the 1/2-inch hexagons. Here's what the butterflies look like next to a flower made with the 1-inch hexagons. Here is what they look like next to a flower made with a 3/4-inch hexagon. Just to give you an idea of the difference in sizes from flower to butterfly depending on the template size you use. So if you want to use a different size for the flower and a different size for the butterfly, you are more than welcome to. And this kind of gives you an idea of what they look like. So this flower is using the 1/2-inch template in comparison with the 3 different sizes of butterflies. And here they are all together in the same frame, so you can get an idea of what they look like when they're all mixed together. I hope you learned something new from this flowers and butterflies pattern and video. Leave a comment down below. What is something new that you've learned about English paper piecing as you work through this particular pattern? I would love to hear your thoughts, your comments, and of course, any questions that you might have. I'm happy to answer those as well. Remember to share your makes over in the Facebook group where you can also connect with the rest of us who are going through this English paper piecing skill building series. That's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, keep on stitching.